Lindsay, my Fluval Stratum girly.
Thanks. Hi.
I'm so excited to nerd out with you today on something that I feel like really only started getting talked about like in the last couple of years. And now you hear these crazy stories of like fish stores being sold out of Fluval Stratum because all the plant people are going and buying it. So you're kind of a propagation extraordinaire. How did you become the plant lady behind all the plant babies?
Well, first of all, I am so honored to be on this podcast. I have been listening to it from the very beginning of
Yes.
my plant adventures. When I first started off with plants, I went to a local plant shop just to meet you, and
I
I
remember
was
that in 2019. Yeah.
I was geeking
Chicago.
out, and I was so excited. So this is like so full circle for me to be on your podcast now. And that was really at the beginning of my plant journey as a plant mom when I was trying to emulate my parents who were big plant people. And I really wanted to start collecting more of the more difficult to grow species. And I really became fascinated with aeroids in the beginning of my journey and alocasias, specifically alocasias and anthuriums, and some of these trickier plants that seem to die easily. I'm not sure why I was drawn to them. I guess the challenge, and also, actually, I do know why I was drawn to them, just because they are so damn beautiful. Sometimes the more beautiful the plant, the more they make you work for them. And so, as many listeners would probably agree, even calatheas, which are now classified as Gopertias, same thing. You're so attracted to these gorgeous plants, and then you find out they're so difficult. So I collected all these plants, and that was when I met you, and I kept buying them. And then I started documenting my journey with these plants on Instagram. So that's when all the plant babies started. And the unfortunate thing is that I would kill a lot of these plants. And I was documenting my journey back then of growing them, killing them, giving advice.
Mm.
Not so much me preaching that I was this master of plants, but that, hey, this is a real deal. Like, this is what I've learned from the experience of growing, experimenting, failing, and then trying again. And so as my account grew, and people came on that journey with me, I became better at growing plants. And as I became better, my plants started to live. And that's a great problem, but it's also a problem because when you're used to buying more and more plants and you just have that hobby of going to the plant shop all the time, and then your plants start to live, well, then you have a jungle because your plants then get bigger and bigger and they're not dying anymore. And so what do you do with these tremendous monsteras that you're like, wait a minute, well, typically you would be dead by now, but now you have turned into a tree. And that anthurium that was a tiny seedling now is a literal bush. And so you have to do something about this situation. So I began to propagate. And that is how I kind of became a self-proclaimed propagation princess, because I really have trouble throwing away any plant tissue because I constantly see every little bit of plant as a potential new plant. And I would take a cutting, propagate it, and then I would say, okay, I'll give this away to a friend. And then I would, but then I'd also make like 3 other plants. And then I'd keep those, and then they would grow into 3 other bushes. And so here I am, kind of like the old lady in a shoe with so many plants, she didn't know what to do. And I am all the plant babies. I have an online shop that grew out of this because I had so many plants. I had to start selling them. I mean, I only have so many friends to give them away to. Actually, a lot of my friends are like, Lindsay, no more plants. Like, you've given us, we cannot take, my friends' husbands actually have bans on me giving them plants because I've given them too many. So I started an online shop, which I've had for a few years now. And I started hybridizing plants, which is creating plant babies by pollination. So I create new species of alocasias and anthuriums. I got so deep down this propagation rabbit hole that I eventually wrote a book. So now I am an author as well. I hope that explained my story.
Yeah, no, because it's one thing propagating a pothos and taking some cuttings, putting it in water, and having it root and planting it up again. But you're like pollinating stuff. Like you're taking propagation to the next level, and your book certainly does that as well. So what is it about propagation that is so appealing to you? Is it, I mean, it sounds like a part of that is waste. Like you don't want plants going to waste. You like the
Right.
joy of sharing plants. But something in me tells me you're a bit of a nerd too, you know, in that it's fun to see roots grow. It's fun to put something in the dirt and see it sprout.
Yes, yes. And when it comes to hybridization or pollination, it's really getting into the nerdy science and creating something new. I mean, to put it in the most simple terms, you're fiddling with genetics. You're looking at a mommy plant and a daddy plant and essentially seeing all the different babies that you can make. I mean, I'm a mother and I have 3 children, and I'm just so fascinated to see, you know, each of my 3 children are so vastly different from each other. And I'm constantly, you know, and I'm very into genealogy as well. Like I'm the person in my family that keeps all of the family trees back to the 1800s. It's a very big hobby of mine. Actually, back to the 1500s on one side. Genealogy and tracing where genetic traits come from is just something that I'm very interested in humans. And when I realized, wow, you know, I can transfer the same passion into my plant hobby. I mean, it was like a light bulb just went off in my head. Like I can take a mommy anthurium and a daddy anthurium, so to speak. I mean, they're not really male and female plants in that way, but let's call them mommy and daddy. I'm breeding them together, and then I'm getting, you know, 100, sometimes 200 seeds, and each one of those babies is completely unique. I get the beautiful but weak ones. I get the strong, robust ones, but that don't have a lot of color. I get the ones that just die off immediately. I mean, just like in nature, sometimes human babies, you know, unfortunately are not viable. So you see the same things that we do in humans as we do with seedlings, the strong, robust to the weak. And it's amazing to see nature play out in our own plant collections.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what is Fluval Stratum, and why has it gotten so popular when it comes to propagation in the last couple of years?
Okay, so Fluval Stratum. Okay, those are 2 very separate big questions, and I could go on and on about it because I just love Fluval Stratum. Okay, what is Fluval Stratum? Fluval Stratum is, well, it looks like little black caviar if you were to take a look at it. And that's what really caught my eye in the first place. I said, what is this stuff that everyone is sticking their cuttings in? It looks like caviar. But it is not. It's not fish eggs. What it is compressed volcanic soil. It's actually volcanic tephra. And when I first saw that word, I said, what the heck is tephra? Tephra is essentially technically anything that a volcano spews out. So it can be volcanic ash, it can be rock, giant rock, or little pebbles. So it is volcanic tephra that comes from a specific volcano, and only one volcano in particular. And that is the Mount Aso, ASO, volcano in Japan. So there is one, I know this is so, when I learned about this, I said, this is the most random thing. Like, you're going to tell me that everyone is using Fluval Stratum and it all comes from this single volcano in Japan and nowhere else. Like they're just, I don't know. I thought that was so random. You just imagine it coming from multiple sources, but I imagine like just everyone migrating to this like one, taking this big, you know, holy trip to this volcano, all these plant lovers, and scooping up this magical Fluval Stratum. But so this volcano is one of the largest volcanoes in the world, actually, and it's still active. And it last erupted in 2021. And in the foothills of this volcano, I have not seen it personally, and there are no pictures online that show the actual Fluval Stratum, but somewhere along the foothills, there is this lush layer of this volcanic soil and Fluval Stratum. So Fluval Stratum, I'm not sure how it is, if it comes already compressed in the little balls or if the companies then compress it into the little balls, but it comes from this volcano. And it's really comprised of these 2 type of rocks, andesite and rhyolite for geology nerds. And this is what Fluval Stratum is essentially. So to sum it up, it is soil compressed from the foothills of the Mount Aso volcano in Japan. It is a soil, it is not a rock, but it has, these volcanic rock-like composition. So when you're using it, when you're touching it, it is soft like a soil. So you can squish these little pellets between your fingers. So it's not to be confused like a hard rock like lechuza pond. You can't really compress it. Well, stratum, if you took a little piece of that caviar-looking caviar-looking piece of Fluval Stratum and smushed it, you can smush it because it is compressed soil.
Okay. What makes it so good for propagation?
Well, the reason why it's so popular is because it works. It works so well. Just on a very basic level, if you pop some cuttings in Fluval Stratum and propagate the right way, I should preface it by saying use it correctly, your cuttings are going to take off. And people are just amazed by the results. And I'm amazed by the results personally that I've seen using this substrate versus, say, sphagnum moss, which prior to Fluval Stratum was like my bestie. I mean, I love sphagnum moss. I also love using perlite. But Fluval gives better results, and I will tell you why in a second. The other reason why people love Fluval Stratum is that it's very accessible. You can, unlike, say, lechuza pond, which always is out of stock. Now we don't even know if we can get it anymore because it's being sold in Europe almost exclusively now, so there's a lot of manufacturing or trade issues. We're not quite sure what's going on with lechuza pond. But Fluval Stratum, like you said, is available in all pet stores. It can be found on Amazon, so it's very easy to order. But in terms of why it works really well, there's a few really major benefits to it. First of all, Fluval Stratum because it has it's made up of little pellets, there is room for oxygen to get between each of the pellets. And when oxygen gets between substrate, just like when you're using leca or you're using perlite, that allows roots to transpire. It allows for more growth in the root zone. So that's why anything like compressed mud is never good to propagate in. You want something that's light and airy. So just the structure being these little balls is beneficial. That's number one. The other reason why it's beneficial is just because it's absorbent and porous. So it's going to absorb the water, it's going to absorb the nutrients, and then release it back. Third reason why it's so beneficial, and this makes it really unique compared to, say, perlite, or even leca, is that it has a buffering capacity, meaning it will lower the pH of the surrounding water to be slightly acidic. Now, the general houseplant enthusiast is like, what does this even mean? Like, I've never checked the pH of my plants. Doesn't really matter. However, it does matter to a lot of plant species in that in order to absorb macronutrients, NPK, that's your fertilizer, right? You have your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium. In order to absorb those nutrients optimally, typically, especially for aeroids, want to be in that around 6 to 6.5 pH range. And Fluval Stratum, for whatever reason, lowers the water to that range. So it's interesting because especially when you're growing anthuriums, a lot of anthurium growers will use this, like a little bit of acid to lower, it's called pH down, to lower, especially hydroponic growers will lower the water in semi-hydroponics to lower the pH of their water. Mm-hmm. But Fluval Stratum will do it for you just naturally. So when your cuttings are taking off in Fluval Stratum and the roots are just growing crazy and faster than they are in others and responding to fertilizer better, there's an actual scientific reason. They may just in fact be taking up and absorbing those nutrients faster than they would in a perlite because the pH is more optimal.
What about leca versus Fluval Stratum? Because leca to me just looks like a larger ball than Fluval Stratum.
Right. Leca's great. Leca does have, it's larger, it's more coarse, so it does have more air pockets. It might be a little less expensive, but it's not going to have that pH buffering capability. So it's not going to change the pH of the water to 6 to 6.5 like Fluval Stratum will, because Fluval Stratum does come from it has that special unique properties because it comes from the volcano. And also, one thing I didn't speak about that's different is that because it comes from that rich volcanic soil, it has trace minerals and micronutrients in it. Not a ton, but it is rich in iron, which is a micronutrient for plants and helps with chlorophyll production. So it is going to give your plants an iron boost. So it has a little bit of an edge in terms of minerals, in terms of pH, and then it has all pretty much the same benefits as leca would and perlite would.
You sold me on Fluval Stratum. I get it. It gives you the edge. It's got the micronutrients. It's got the right ratio of air to water. How do I propagate in Fluval Stratum? I'm actually holding, now this is an audio interview, but people who are listening, Lindsay joined me on an Instagram Live a while back, and we did a propagation of some of my Hoya with Fluval Stratum, and I am very happy to report that I have lots of roots in my Fluval Stratum. So I can say, firsthand that this Fluval Stratum thing really does work really well.
That's awesome.
So how do you propagate in Fluval Stratum?
So the other day I was in an Anthurium Facebook group and I was saying how much I love Fluval Stratum. And inevitably there were a few people on there saying like, I don't like Fluval Stratum. Mm-hmm. And, I shouldn't use a bad voice. Like, I don't like Fluval Stratum because Fluval Stratum haters are not bad people and they don't have bad voices. They're very sweet people. They're just misunderstood, perhaps, because if you hate Fluval Stratum or you did not see good results with Fluval Stratum, there's a good chance it's just that you were letting your Fluval Stratum dry out.
Okay.
And truly, that's probably the only thing that you could have done that made you a Fluval Stratum. Well, there's two things that you could do to make you a Fluval Stratum hater. One is that you let your Fluval Stratum dry out, and therefore the root system of your plant dried out, mm-hmm. and then the whole cutting process, the whole rooting process went kaput. So it's similar to sphagnum moss in that you want to keep the Fluval Stratum damp the entire time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a mason jar that's filled with Fluval Stratum, and I've kept the bottom third of the Fluval Stratum covered in water, as per your instructions. Yeah.
Perfect. And what I tell people too is that, and I've experimented with different levels of moisture in the Fluval Stratum. Truly, Fluval Stratum is so forgiving. You can keep the bottom third of the container filled with water, or you can keep the bottom half, or honestly, you can just keep the whole thing filled with water. I've seen it done all ways, but when you're propagating in Fluval Stratum, typically one of the easiest ways to do is to start off with a jar. Let's just say you have a mason jar, any jar with a closed bottom, and you stick your cutting in and maybe leave 2 inches on the bottom and put, or maybe don't put your cutting in yet. Pour 2 inches of Fluval Stratum on the bottom, then stick your cutting in and fill the remainder in with Fluval Stratum. So you have just a little space on the bottom for just Fluval Stratum. And even if your cutting touches the bottom of the jar, that's okay too. Fluval, again, is so forgiving unless you let it dry out. Mm-hmm. And you don't need a drainage hole either on the bottom when propagating in Fluval. You just don't. You could have a drainage hole. You could, as long as you don't let the Fluval dry out. So if you don't have a drainage hole, just keep an inch or 2 of water on the bottom of the jar. If you do have a drainage hole, you're just going to have to water more frequently to keep the Fluval moist.
Because it's the moisture that the Fluval needs to be moist in order to give the roots need air, but the roots also need moisture to grow. So it's that moist Fluval Stratum is the key to creating the perfect conditions for the plant to root really successfully.
Exactly. And I have not seen, at least in my experience, and I'm sure there'll be someone out there listening that says, no, I've seen it. So I'm going to say, in my experience, personally, with the hundreds and hundreds of plants that I've rooted in Fluval Stratum, I have never seen a plant get, quote unquote, overwatered in Fluval Stratum. It's a different type of substrate. It's not like muddy compressed soil. There's a lot of air pockets. It's porous. You just keep it moist. And you will know when it starts to dry out too, because it goes from shiny and black to kind of a grayish, dry looking color.
Yeah,
And then just
totally.
add water.
I even just I'm looking at my jar that I have, and like the bottom half is shiny and the top half is dry,
Right.
which is interesting too. So, so I've propagated this Hoya that we propagated together. I'm going to plant this up soon because we almost have enough root branching. Can I reuse Fluval Stratum? Like after I take this Hoya out, can I just pop new cuttings of a different plant in?
Absolutely. I mean, I reuse my Fluval because Fluval Stratum is, and I should also make note that Fluval Stratum, Fluval is just the brand. So Stratum is the product, Fluval is the brand, and there is a couple other brands on the market. So Aqueon makes Stratum, and Xterra just started putting some out as well. So you could price shop, and it all comes from the Mount Aso volcano in Japan. So look around. But yes, absolutely, as long as there was no root rot, because root rot does stem from bacteria, and that could spread to other plants. Absolutely reuse the stratum because that stuff's expensive and there is no problem reusing it. However, it will deteriorate over time, especially, and you'll notice it. I mean, it's not like a set time period. The more you use it, the more you handle it, you will start to notice that instead of those nicely formed balls, it will start to smush and squish and become more like a muddy dirt. Once that starts to happen, again, you could still technically use it, but it's just not going to provide as much aeration for your roots, and you might notice the health of the plants decline over time. After, a good rule of thumb is after a year, you'll want to replace the Fluval, or when you start noticing a lot of algae build up on it, which you will see from keeping it wet all the time, you'll want to replace it.
Okay, so I have gotten inspired by this episode. I've taken one of my plants. Well, number one, are there certain plants that do really well rooting in Fluval Stratum and others that don't? Or if I want to propagate any of my houseplant collection, I can do it in Fluval?
Honestly, I have not seen a single plant that does not root well in Fluval Stratum.
If you're doing alocasia corms in Fluval, are you doing the same thing? You're just setting the corms on top of the Fluval?
I stick the corms almost all the way into the Fluval, but until you can only see the Hershey Kiss-like top sticking out.
Interesting. Like bulbs, almost. Like,
Yes.
if you were forcing bulbs. Oh, that's so cool. So say I have a general houseplant. Let's choose a philodendron, whatever your basic, or let's choose a monstera. I want to propagate a monstera and I'm putting it in Fluval. What am I looking for that propagation before I take it out, right? Because we're not putting plants in Fluval forever. We're rooting them in order to then pop them up in soil. So what are your recommendations for growing in Fluval? What should I be looking out for? What will the process be?
So first of all, I don't recommend necessarily, especially for a large plant like a monstera, that you propagate straight into Fluval because Fluval is expensive and that's a large plant. So I definitely think you should use Fluval, but what I'd recommend is cutting it a little bit with some perlite.
Okay, so you're making a substrate of Fluval and perlite. Got it.
I just add some chunky perlite because you'll still get the same benefits of the Fluval and you'll still get the same results, but add some perlite to kind of make it a little less lighter on your wallet, and it will extend the life of your bag of Fluval.
I love
that. So especially when I'm using these big plants, because I have a lot of big monsteras that I'm propagating, I'll cut it even 50-50 with big chunky perlite. So I'm still getting that like pH benefit and the micronutrient benefit. And if anything, it's adding some big chunky air pockets, which those monsteras love. And then I'll use a big vase, and I will do the same thing. I will fill a couple inches of this perlite and Fluval mixture on the bottom, stick my cutting in, and then fill the rest up with the Fluval and perlite. And then fill the bottom few inches up with water, set it in a bright, warm, sunny location, and then wait until the roots of your plant are roughly 1.5 to 2 inches long.
Mm-hmm.
And, someone asked me recently in a propagation workshop, they said, well, how will you know? What if you can't see it? How can you tell if your roots are that long? I said, well, unfortunately for my husband, that's when I go around emptying these jars of
Mhm.
Fluval Stratum all over my kitchen counters to pull my
Mhm.
cuttings out. And he's like, Lindsay, what are you doing? This is where I'm cooking dinner. And I'm like, sorry, I have to check my roots. How will I know, Priorities.
And propagating in clear, like I have mine in a clear mason jar. That's helpful too because you can see through it.
Yes. Yes.
And also it's helpful with the water level too. Like I'm looking right now and I'm like, actually, I could probably put some more water in mine.
Yes.
Okay, so you're looking for 1.5 to 2 inch long roots. Are you looking for root branching as well?
Yeah, definitely. Looking for those secondary roots. So, not just like one primary thick root coming out, but
Hmm.
like you said, like the branching, when it looks like little branches coming off, those secondary roots coming off, that's wonderful. But truly, most important thing is 1.5 to 2 inches long. I personally like to wait until they're like 2 inches long. I find the most success with most plants before transferring it then to a different substrate.
I love that. Okay, cool. Is there, a while back, everybody was into semi hydro, passive hydroponics. Is there a way, like, can I use Fluval Stratum as the growing media if I wanted to grow in semi hydro? Can I keep my plants in Fluval instead of repotting it once those roots get 2 inches long?
Yeah, people do. People grow using a semi-hydro setup, which is essentially like a self-watering pot with a wick. And instead of like lechuza pon, they will use fluval stratum. I don't grow that way because I will use a lechuza pon substrate for longer term growing in my
Mhm.
self-watering pots, and I reserve the fluval stratum mainly for propagation in jars. But you certainly could do that. The reason why I don't do it is because self-watering pots are expensive and I don't like to change things out a lot. And
Mm.
I mean, and by a lot, I mean if I could keep something in its pot for a couple of years. I always say that, but then I always end up like having to repot it anyway. But when I pot something up, I tell myself, this is going to be in here for a couple of years. And so with lechuza pon, at least I'm giving myself that chance that it will be in there for a couple of years, because lechuza pon is essentially a bunch of rocks that won't
It's
deteriorate.
hardier. It doesn't break down as fast as the Fluval
Yes.
does. Okay. So Fluval makes more
Fluval.
sense for a season instead of a lifetime.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, because it is going to break down. Like by a year, it's going to get a little muddier.
Got it. And then is there a recommended amount of time? I think so many people struggle with propagation of when to pot the cutting up and like how to not leave the cutting too long in water or too long in this, too long in that. Do you have recommendations for like an amount of time that you shouldn't keep a cutting in fluval stratum for too long so that it wouldn't successfully transplant? And do you have any transplanting tips for putting your cuttings into soil?
That's a great question. That's kind of why fluval stratum's so awesome, and it's one of the biggest questions in the fluval stratum group, is because people notice that their plants are thriving so well in fluval
Mm,
stratum that
interesting.
you don't want to take it out, because here,
Hmm.
I mean, I have this beautiful Oxalis triangularis that, I mean, it just took off and is blooming in this cup of fluval stratum. And honestly, I didn't take it out. Like, I mean, it was there just so that the bulbs could sprout, but then it just formed this gorgeous bouquet. And I said, I can't move this. I
Mm.
mean, I risk I risk it kind of going into shock and all the little shamrock, beautiful purple shamrocks just curling
Mm.
up. It's just such a sensitive little thing that I said, I'm going to, and I gifted it to my mother and she kept it. I think she still has it in the same cup of fluval stratum, and it's gorgeous. And there's no way I'm going to move it. And so a lot of people will keep their props in fluval stratum, but what the feedback has been from people generally that do that is after about a year, you will start to notice either a slight decline or a stagnation, like a
Okay.
slight stagnation in growth. And I do believe that's either due to lack of fertilizing, because again, fluval stratum does not have the proper amount of macronutrients. So you still need that NPK. You have to still fertilize.
Hmm.
Once your plants have roots, you need to add fertilizer. Once your plants have roots, you will need to. Not right away, but once your plants have roots, add that NPK. But either that's why people are seeing a decline, and two, it's because, again, the structure is deteriorating and you're getting less oxygen between those molecules of dirt, and therefore you're not getting enough aeration for the root zone. So you might have to change out the fluval after a
And
year.
when I do get that 2 inch long root and it's time for me to pot up my fluvally rooted cutting into potting media, do you have any tips for people to have a successful transfer? Because obviously fluval and potting media are two very different things. Those roots are used to the
Right.
fluval. So how do you graduate to a potting media successfully?
Okay, so the beauty of transferring a cutting from fluval to say a chunky soil mix as opposed to something from water to a
Yeah.
chunky soil mix is that the roots have already adapted to a solid medium in Fluval Stratum. So you have soil-like roots already. So they're going to recognize a solid medium when you transfer it. So you're not going to get that much shock as you would if you rooted in water. And then you get water roots, and which are smoother and have less hair on them, and then you transfer to soil and you see a lot of plants get shock. And to reduce that shock, I always recommend placing your plant in like a humidity chamber to help support the plant during that transition time. But when you're transferring from fluval to soil, it's a pretty seamless transition because it already has developed roots which are used to a solid medium. So it's solid to solid. However, to reduce shock of any kind, especially when you're dealing with very sensitive plants, you have those very finicky alocasias or something like a very thin-leafed begonia, you can always place your plant temporarily in a propagation box, a grow tent, any kind of closed, clear plastic container, just to keep the humidity at around 100%, 80 to 100% for a few weeks after transplanting, just to give the leaves that extra support while the roots are adjusting.
Got it. Amazing. Have you ever done those experiments where like you take the same style of cutting and you put it in fluval and leca and perlite and water and see?
Yes, actually, I have not done that experiment with cuttings with fluval, but I've done a couple extensive experiments with anthurium seeds, comparing its growth or their growth in Fluval Stratum versus aeroid mix versus tree fern fiber versus sphagnum moss. Because in the past couple of years, growing anthurium seeds has become
Yeah.
so popular, and germinating these seeds in sphagnum moss and tree fern fiber has been very popular. Oh, and peat moss as well is very popular and the most conventional method. And then Fluval Stratum came to the market. Well, it's been on the market for aquarium use for a while, but in the plant hobby became so popular, I really wanted to test whether the seedlings would grow as fast or faster using this volcanic substrate. And I was blown away by the results. I was blown away by my initial experiment because the seeds that were in the Fluval Stratum grew faster, and the seedlings themselves, once the seeds took root, were bigger and more robust.
Wow.
And of course, it's all about sample size. So it's a smaller sample size. And like I mentioned in the beginning, when you're growing and seedlings, every seed is unique. So I thought maybe these are just the strong babies. Maybe I happened to pick the strong kids, and the weaker kids got the other substrate by coincidence. So I repeated the experiment using hundreds of seeds. I mean, it was just a very massive experiment, and over, I believe it was a month time, and it was pretty big and controlled, and all the seeds were in the same environment, and there was no question that the Fluval Stratum was the winner in terms of the seeds sprouted faster. Well, and once they sprouted, they just took off so much more quickly than in the other mediums. And it followed quickly by sphagnum moss and the tree fern fiber, but there was no contest. So since then, I exclusively use
Well,
the Fluval Stratum.
I need to have you back on for an anthurium seed pollination episode because that
Yeah,
sounds like a
sure.
whole nother deep dive. But this was so fun. I mean, thank you personally for introducing me to Fluval. I've never used it before, but because of this Instagram live we did, I ordered some on the internet. I ordered the wrong type. It's been super fun, and I'm excited to, your bulb situation. I'm like, oh, I have a bunch of daffodils. Like maybe I'll make a flower arrangement with some daffodil bulbs and Fluval and see
Ooh,
if they sprout. But anyway, this has been so fun. You're so knowledgeable. You're such a nerd. Also, it's been so, I mean,
I
we've known
am a
each other for
nerd.
so long. So it's full circle for me too, having met you so long ago and now having you on the show. Where can people find you and where can people find your book? Tell us a little bit about your book because you've got propagations on propagations in that book for anybody who, was excited and stimulated from this conversation.
Definitely, definitely. Well, you can find my book anywhere most places books are sold.
And what's
Amazon,
it called?
Target, Barnes and Noble. It's the ultimate guide to houseplant propagation. And in it, you will find how to propagate everything from a simple pothos cuttings to how to pollinate. It's actually the first book ever to describe how to pollinate your own anthuriums and make these babies.
I
Yeah,
didn't
so
know that.
it's
Very cool.
and there's lots of corny plant jokes. So if that's your thing, check it out. And yeah, you could find me on Instagram often making those same corny plant jokes, unfortunately. For better or for worse, that's who I am. So all the plant babies on Instagram and TikTok, and yeah, my website is alltheplantbabies.com. Basically, it's all the plant babies everywhere, all the time. So check
Everywhere,
it
all the
out.
time, all the time. Well, you're a delight. Thanks so much for being here today and
So
nerding out.